Well, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of FCSM and COPAS, I want to welcome you all to our fourth of 8 webinars on confidentiality and data access, entitled Disclosure Review Boards, Design, Governance, and Modernization. My name is Paul Schroeder, and I'm the Executive Director of COPAS. Each of these webinars we repurposed from the FCSM conference initially scheduled for April. Other sessions from the April program have been converted to a virtual FCSM conference taking place on September 21st, and registration is now open at fcsm2020.org. I want to remind you that today's webinar is being recorded, and the video will be posted to the COPAS website within the next week. I'm going to now turn it over to Michael Hawes from the Census Bureau, who is the chair of the session. Michael?
Great, thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology, I'd like to welcome you to this installment in our webinar series on confidentiality and data access, and I'd like to thank COPAPS for their help organizing this event. Today's topic is Disclosure Review Boards, Design, Governance, and Modernization. Protecting the confidentiality of federal data assets while making those data available to the public has been a significant challenge for several decades. And if you could all mute your phones, please, I would greatly appreciate it. Protecting confidentiality of federal data assets while promoting data access has been a challenge for a long time. However, the recent proliferation of rich third-party data from corporations, from social media, and from the various notable data breaches that have occurred over the years, coupled with increasingly powerful algorithms that can leverage those data for re-identification attacks, have made these challenges that agencies face even greater. So enter the role of agencies' disclosure review boards. Today's speakers come from a diverse set of agencies and represent different levels of institutionalization and maturity of their approaches to disclosure avoidance and data governance more generally. Their presentations will discuss the different ways that their agencies' disclosure review boards are structured, how they operate, and the challenges, successes, and the lessons that they've learned along the way. We're going to have 4 presentations today, and we will have a question and answer and discussion afterwards. So during the presentations, if you have questions for the speakers, please enter those into the chat box. I'll be monitoring those and getting to those during the Q&A. Our first speaker today is Daniel Toth from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Daniel is the Senior Research Mathematical Statistician in the BLS Office of Survey Methods Research, and he's the chair of the BLS Disclosure Review Board. Daniel has a PhD from Indiana University and is currently an associate editor for the American Statistician and for Survey Methodology. He's published research in the areas of survey methodology, especially in developing tree-based methods for complex sample designs, their application to non-response analysis, and disclosure limitation methodology. And he's the author of the R package RPMS, which allows users to build design-consistent regression trees using survey data. He's a member and fellow of the American Statistical Association. Daniel, take it away. While we're waiting for Daniel to call back in, I'll actually use this time to introduce the presenters for the next presentation. The 2 presenters for that presentation are going to be Rob Sinkowitz and Gary Benedetto, both from the U.S. Census Bureau. Rob is the chief of the Center for Enterprise Dissemination at the U.S. Census Bureau. In that capacity, he directs a diverse group of professionals who are responsible for assuring that the Census Bureau can effectively disseminate the maximum amount of high-quality data about the nation's people and economy while fully meeting the Census Bureau's legal and ethical obligations to protect the confidentiality of respondents and the information that they provide. Prior to joining the Census Bureau, Rob was the Deputy Director of the Technology Innovation Program at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, where he directed the work of senior scientific and economic professionals and controlled investments in high-risk, high-reward technologies. Rob earned his bachelor's in economics from the University of Notre Dame, his PhD in economics from the Catholic University of America, and his MBA from Georgetown University. The other presenter for that next presentation is Gary Benedetto. Gary is the Assistant Center Chief of Disclosure Avoidance in the Center for Enterprise Dissemination at the U.S. Census Bureau. He has his PhD in economics from the University of Maryland, College Park, His work at the Census Bureau is focused primarily on missing data imputation and data synthesis. He also serves as the technical co-chair on the Census Bureau's Disclosure Review Board.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. Hi, first, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again, Paul, Michael, Basla, Janet, and Kopas for this opportunity to talk about disclosure avoidance at the Census Bureau and to share with you some of the practices that our Disclosure Review Board, or our DRB, has adopted over the years. Let me just do a sound check right now. Can everyone hear me?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. Next slide, please. We thought it would be appropriate if we could provide a high-level overview of data stewardship at the Census Bureau, as well as the guarantees of privacy protection. In short, I'll be providing an overview of the environment in which our DRB operates. My colleague, Dr. Gary Benedetto, will be providing details of the activities of the Disclosure Review Team, or DART for short. Next slide, please. The Census Bureau guarantees confidentiality protections. Central to this guarantee is the integral role that the Census Bureau professionals play in upholding this promise. As you may know, all Census Bureau employees take an oath of non-disclosure. That means we promise to adhere to laws protecting our data, and this oath is for life. Next slide, please. The laws that we swear to uphold guide all that we do at the Census Bureau. These laws that govern data stewardship at the Census Bureau are Title V of the U.S. Code, which pertains to the laws and regulations related to government organization and employees, including the protection of the individual records maintained by agencies. Title 13 of the U.S. Code, Section 9. Specifically, this section states that the census may not, quote, make any publication whereby the data furnished by any particular establishment or individual under this title can be identified. Third, it's Confidential Information Protection and Statistical Efficiency Act of 2002, or CIPSE for short, which establishes uniform confidentiality protections for information collected for statistical purposes by U.S. statistical agencies. And finally, Title 26 of the U.S. Code, Section 6103, and that refers to tax returns. And it states that tax returns and return information shall be confidential. Next slide, please. As I stated earlier, we guarantee protection, and we take this seriously. For example, in the event of any confirmed or suspected IT security incidents or any mishandling of Title V, Title 13, or Title 26 data or administratively restricted information, we are responsible for reporting to the Census Bureau Computer Response Team, or filing a BOC cert within 1 hour. Next, please. As you probably surmised, disclosure avoidance at the Census Bureau is part of a larger system. It's institutionalized. It is not an afterthought, and it's integrated in all that we do. Next slide, please. Central to this effort is the Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee, or DSEP for short. DSEP is composed of our most senior executives and serves as the focal point for decision-making and communication on policy issues related to privacy, security, confidentiality, and administrative records. Its mission is to ensure that the Census Bureau can effectively and responsibly collect and use data about the nation's people and economy. Doing so requires protecting respondents' privacy and data confidentiality throughout the entire life cycle. This responsibility reflects the Census Bureau's firm commitment to fully meeting the legal, ethical, and reporting obligations levied by the Census Act, the Privacy Act, CIPSE, and all other applicable statutes and legal authorities, including those of government agencies such as Title 26. To assist in its effort, DSEP has multiple supporting committees. One supporting committee is Privacy and Policy Research Committee. Another is the Data Integration and Policy Committee. There are several others, but what we'll be talking about is the Disclosure Review Board. We are the Disclosure Review Board, or the DRB. Next, please. Next slide. The DRB supports DCEP in its efforts to ensure that every information product released by the Census Bureau, previous slide please, released by the Census Bureau adheres to the confidentiality requirements of Title 13 and other applicable statutes. This includes proposing policies and setting methodologies, underlying confidentiality protection, reviewing Census Bureau information products for potential disclosure concerns before they are publicly released, identifying research opportunities, and coordinating the confidentiality-related activities needed to inform decision-making on data collection, data linking, and data dissemination. The DRB provides a mechanism for a comprehensive and consistent approach to disclosure avoidance that protects respondent confidentiality in our publicly released tabulations, microdata, and other information products. The DRB operates under the authority invested by DCEP and is empowered to decontrol or otherwise approve for release information products when the confidentiality of the data used to create those products is protected by a statute such as Title 13, Title 26, C. The DRB and its delegates review and clear all Census Bureau information products within their peer review for public release. Next slide, please. So what is the structure of the DRB? We currently have 12 voting, or according to our charter, we've got 12 voting members from across the Census Bureau and two technical co-chairs and in professional, administrative, and managerial staff. Next, please. Next slide. This includes the DRB coordinator and information manager, as well as the DRB program manager, who really keep the boat afloat during for all of the work that we do. Next slide, please. With this, we are continually researching and applying advanced methods, and I'm going to be turning it over to Gary Benedetto, who is the Assistant Center Chief for Disclosure Avoidance, or STED-DA, his team researches and analyzes disclosure, risk, and proposes protection schemes for microdata, for tabular data, and for other statistical output. I'll be turning it over to Gary right now to talk more about what the DRB actually does. Thank you, Gary. Next slide, please.
All right, thank you, Rob. Quick sound check, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. So as Rob said, I'll be talking a little bit more about the Disclosure Avoidance Review team and a little bit more specifics on how the DRB actually operates. So we've kind of broken up the disclosure avoidance official into three kind of classifications, and there's a certification each step of the way. So the first tier is what we call the Disclosure Avoidance Coordinator, and that's sort of the most basic tier where you kind of understand the administration and the policies of the DRB and how to do proper record keeping. Once you've become a Disclosure Avoidance Coordinator, and that's a very easy step, about an hour-long training with some of our staff. Once you've become a Disclosure Avoidance Coordinator, you can then take a class to become a Disclosure Avoidance Reviewer. So we have developed a day-and-a-half-long class that sort of teaches our philosophy towards disclosure avoidance review, goes over a lot of the legacy disclosure limitation methods used around the Census Bureau for the various products that are released, as well as introduces where we're trying to go with the modernization efforts towards formal privacy. At the end of that day-and-a-half-long class, you can take a test, and if you pass that test, you are certified as a disclosure avoidance reviewer at the Census Bureau. At that point in time, you can begin doing disclosure avoidance reviews and representing requests at the DRB meetings, but you cannot yet release anything by yourself. So a disclosure avoidance reviewer will attend DRB meetings, become familiar with the way that the board members think and how they make their decisions. And once a DAR has represented 4 submissions, clean submissions that get approved without any sort of amendments, they can apply to become a disclosure avoidance officer. So that's sort of the final tier, and the board members will vote on whether a DAR should be granted that certification. And if the board agrees, then that DAR becomes a DAO and gets something called DRB delegated authority. So the DAO can actually review an item, and if it meets certain criteria, release that item on their own and keep careful records and release their own disclosure avoidance review number to the requester. Next slide. This basically goes over what I just talked about, so we can go on to the next slide. So now I'll sort of walk through a flow of review from initiation through to approval if it is approved and the record keeping. So next slide. It starts with a Census Bureau staff member, whether they're doing a research project or if they are part of a production team, or it could even be a researcher, an external researcher from the Federal Statistical Research Data Centers. They'll reach out to either an RDC admin or if it's a Census Bureau employee to a DAR in their area to begin a review of their product. And so we'll call this person the information product originator. And it can be any product that depends on protected data. So at that point in time, the DAR becomes the primary point of contact for this review and begins to assemble all the relevant information. And there's quite a bit of back and forth at this stage where the DAR will communicate what is kind of expected from the originator in terms of proper description of the methodology and supporting statistics that are pertinent to the review. Next slide. So at this point in time, the DAR will do a thorough review of the product. If they are a DAO, they can make a decision to use their delegated authority. Or if they're a DAO and not certain about that, they would kick it over to the Disclosure Review Board. And of course, if they're not a DAO, they have to bring it before the Disclosure Review Board. Next slide. If they are a DAO and they think that delegated authority is appropriate, they go through our DRB delegated authority checklist, and basically all the applicable fields on the checklist should be checked off for it to meet the criteria of even being eligible for release by a delegated authority. And if they do release it by a delegated authority, they must keep very careful records of what they released, why they released it, and the release number that they gave to the researcher. And these release numbers are important. We ask the researchers or the product people to put these release numbers clearly and visibly on their products for when they're published. Next slide. If they're not comfortable with it or do not have the authority yet, they'll submit it to the DRB for review. And there's a little bit extra documentation that goes into that. And they'll collect all the appropriate documentation, fill it out, collect all the appropriate support statistics and methodology descriptions, and put those in a secure file folder for the DRB members to see. Next slide. So some of the documentation that we're talking about, there's a cover sheet that sort of goes over very high level points about the request. Then we have some checklists, and apparently we can't count too well. It says 4, but there are five checklists currently that we have that go into a little bit more detail about the request. So, and we have a different checklist for different types of data. So there's a microdata checklist for public use files or microsamples. There's a demographic tabular data checklist. There's an economic tabular data checklist. And when I say economic, I mean for data on businesses, because sometimes there are slightly different privacy issues that creep up there. There's a qualitative data checklist for, sometimes we have research asking people's opinions in focus groups, and it's a little bit different from the other stuff that we do, but we still need to check for privacy. And then we also now developed an interagency agreement toolkit because we want to get in at the beginning stages of these agreements so that we're not agreeing to things that the DRB will be forced to deny at the end of perhaps years of work. Next slide. Maybe in the interest of time, we can skip this. This is sort of has to do with the timeline of the DRB. When the board meets, we go over the submissions. The DAR will introduce the submission, and the information product originator will usually be online to add any clarifications or answer any questions. The board members will discuss and then come up with a decision, and we'll go over some of these decisions in more detail in a moment. And we take very careful meeting minutes so that we can review past decisions that might be pertinent to future decisions. And of course, if we do approve anything, we keep very careful records and issue a DRB approval number. Again, that should be displayed upon any publication that goes out. And we don't differentiate. Any request that's leaving the firewall must go through this process, whether the plan is to publish it on the front page of the Washington Post or just share it with a couple of colleagues. If it's leaving the firewall, we treat it the same. Next page. So Rob already talked about how the DRB is composed, but during any given meeting, of those 12 members, we need at least 8 members to be present to hold the meeting for quorum. We typically try to reach a consensus on all the votes. There can be cases where we cannot reach a consensus. In such cases, if the 2 technical co-chairs and 2/3 of the members present and voting all agree, we can still release a product, although we very rarely have any situation like this. We pretty much always continue the conversation until we can reach a consensus. Also, sometimes we're asked to review things just for informational purposes, not to actually vote on anything. So somebody might have a big request that they envision in the future, and they want to make sure they dot all their I's and cross all their T's. So they might come just ask for information, what to expect early on in the process. Next slide. So what are the decisions that the DRB can make? Obviously, we can just approve something outright if we deem it to pose minimal disclosure risk. Sometimes we deem it to pose minimal disclosure risk, but there are just a couple small changes we need, whether this be one number wasn't quite rounded properly, or there was a little typo in the documentation and we want to make sure all our documentation is accurate. In these cases, we don't need to have this come again to the DRB. We'll trust the DAR to verify that the amendments have taken place. The next option down would be a revise and resubmit. This is where a little bit more significant changes are required, and the DRB really wants to see it again before it's released. Next slide. And I know we're just about out of time, but I think we're just about done, so we should be good. Sometimes maybe the DAR isn't available, or an information project originator isn't available for the meeting, and certain questions can't be answered. So it's not that we reject it, but we just need to wait until another day to go over it, so we'll table it. And then very rarely, we try to avoid this, it can be rejected if it's just way off base. But typically, we try to at least get to revise and resubmit. We see ourselves as shepherds of these data products. And then finally, sometimes a methodology, a disclosure avoidance methodology will be used that we're not familiar with on the DRB, or we don't have the expertise to really evaluate, in which case we can send it out to an external, perhaps academic expert for review. And then, of course, sometimes we have formal privacy methodologies that have a privacy budget, and we'll recommend the parameters for the privacy budget and send it on to the chief scientist in DCEP, but they ultimately make the policy decision on what that budget should be. Next slide. And that's it. That's all we have. I expect we'll have a great conversation in the discussion period. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Rob. Just going to circle back and see if Daniel managed to get on through the phone.
Daniel, I just unmuted your microphone on my end.
Yep, I'm on.
Great. Let me pull up your presentation.
All right.
And Daniel, did you want to go back and go a few slides earlier, or is this okay?
I don't know what people heard and what they didn't hear. So real fast, just to recap, our DRB, some form of DRB started in 1999. And the structure, I don't know. I mean, the structure I was showing you that we get 2 members each from the 3 main offices at Bureau of Labor Statistics that do most of the producing of product. And when I mean most, I mean like just about all of the familiar products you're familiar with from BLS. And so we were tasked with, this is our Disclosure Review Board charter. We got a new charter when I took over, soon after I took over, I guess, and it had 3 main tasks that we're tasked with doing, and that is usual review of disclosure risk when a new product comes about, systematic reviews, also staying in touch with current research and disclosure limitation. And then the last one that's underlined here in this slide is the increase awareness and expand awareness of disclosure review around the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is sort of a new mandate. That's pretty much the biggest change in this charter. Next slide, please. So I'm glad the census folks got to go, because I wanted to just point out, sort of a difference. I'm not sure what year theirs was started, but maybe ours feels newer or something, because one of my biggest challenges, I would say, when we took over is making the BLS folks aware that there is a disclosure review board, and that they need to, and how you go through it, and that you need to go through it, was one of our main challenges, I would say. And so we're doing a lot of accomplishing all 3 of those missions with a new sort of SharePoint. This is a snippet from our page. It's an internal intranet page that now makes it, one-stop shopping for your disclosure review needs. So it's got on here, next slide, please. So how we accomplish this, first of all, we'll talk about our membership. Go ahead, next slide. That zooms into that. One change we did make, so these are, you'll see, so there's the 3 main offices, each give 2 representatives, and then there's a member from OSMR and a member from our Office of Administration, which is the lawyers and things, which is helpful to have. Next slide, please. One change we did make is when we first started, they had to be, one had to be a math stat and one had to be an economist, and from the program side. And that distinction didn't seem to make a lot of sense. It didn't seem to matter. What we found was maybe more important was that the people involved actually had an interest and wanted to be on the Disclosure Review Board. So we've sort of changed that to get 2 representatives from the offices that just want to be on there, because this is, again, I'm not sure about the difference between us and the census on this, but this is not the majority of people's work, what they're required to do. So it's, maybe at most consider 20%. I would say 20% is probably more than they're allotted for this. Probably 20% of my time is spent on Disclosure Review Board stuff. But so anyway, so getting somebody that really cares about it and wants to do it seems to be more helpful. So going back to that page, we also have made it real simple for how do you do a request. So there's a button for when you want to submit a request, you hit Disclosure Review Board, and it sends, it gives you the place to go that you can do it. Next slide, please. And so that makes it simple for people because, like I said, just getting them to know we exist and how do you ask for help. The other thing that's on this page is really nice is 2 things. So on the left arrow is those reports. And so now after every time we do something, we review disclosure limitation method or a new product or a new proposal, and it's significant, of some sort of significance that we think would be helpful for others, we put into a report, and that goes up on that left side so people can access those and see. So if they have a similar type of problem or something that they're thinking about, it gives them some ideas on what they could do for a disclosure limitation. The other, the arrow going up is the tabular practice worksheet. That was started long before I got there. I'm not sure who thought of this, but it's a giant table, Excel spreadsheet that has all of what's currently done for every product that we release to the public. So what is their method? Is it a P% rule? Is it any method that's used? It doesn't have the parameters, obviously, in there, but it gives you a contact person for that disclosure in that office, and as well as, like I said, what they're doing. So it gives people a sense of what's being done and what maybe they can think about doing. Next slide, please. The next one's just going to give you an example of what our template is for those reports. So, like I said, after we do a request, we put it in one of these reports, and then those are available on this web page. Next slide, please. And lastly, we have this reference thing that got cut off, but I have the next slide shows you. We have a lot of things there. So getting information out, we have, there's working paper 22 is up there, so different materials, that reference materials. But also, you'll notice on here some of those, like the number 6, that was a talk that we had. So we started a new Disclosure Review Board seminar series, so that we've invited different people. So John Abod was nice enough to come and give us a talk, and Hank Kim gave us a talk. And so anytime someone comes and gives something, or a webinar like from Michael Hawes, we showed the webinar. And so when we can get those slides and we can put them up here, and like I said, we publicize the webinars and get those to show throughout the BLS, which has helped get people's attention about disclosure limitation. I think that's about it. Next slide, and that's all. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you, Daniel, and thank you for calling in. The sound quality was much better. Okay, our third presenter. Yeah, it happens. Our third presenter today is going to be Darius Singh Purwalla. Darius is a mathematical statistician currently employed in the National Science Foundation's National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, NCSES. His NCSES portfolio includes statistical standards, database management, analysis, and statistical confidentiality. Before joining NCSES, Mr. Singh Purwalla worked as a statistical consultant, both independently and as part of established firms, and as a database marketer. He received a Master of Science in Statistics from Stanford University and a PhD in kinesiology with a focus on what motivates people to exercise from the University of Maryland. Take it away, Darius.
Okay, thanks to Michael for that introduction, and thanks to Paul and Boshla for hosting the platform that's allowed us to get together during this pandemic. Next slide, please. So just the next slide kind of gives an overview of the talk. DRB at NCSES is relatively new. I'd say it's been formed within the past couple years. So I thought I would talk a little bit about why we set it up and how we approach the work, and more specifically, like how I feel that our disclosure processes have been improved by this establishment of the Disclosure Review Board within NCSES. So I'll talk a little bit about what we do, how we approach disclosure prior to the establishment of the DRB, and then how things looked once we ended up establishing the DRB, and I'll talk about a couple of the primary functions that we engage in as well. Next slide. So the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics is situated within the National Science Foundation, and it's one of the 13 principal statistical agencies within the United States. We're charged with collecting and reporting data on the science and engineering enterprise, and specifically we look at the number of new research scientists entering the S&E pipeline, the career trajectories of said scientists and engineers, as well as the financial investment in R&D from federal, state, and local governments, businesses, and academic institutions. So, and as many of you do, NCSES collects the necessary information to produce our estimates of interest using surveys. And we usually conduct these through contractual support. The survey contractors perform data functions such as collection, editing, imputation, and other statistical computing, as well as table creation. And then as it relates to statistical disclosure, how we usually operate is we provide the contractors our disclosure rules, and they implement them in the tables, and we bless the tables or other products that the contractors or our own staff create for us for disclosure. So prior to establishing the DRE, NCSES conducts its work very decentralized. So the majority of the survey operations are being conducted at contractor sites. Disclosure products can also be decentralized as well. And so each of the surveys had their own sets of unique disclosure strategies. They had their own stakeholders, and generally there was minimal communication across NCSES as it relates to disclosure practices. And I don't think these are necessarily bad things, but I thought that the center could benefit from a governing body that oversaw disclosure-related issues. And so additionally, I felt that the nature of our collections themselves lent themselves to a more coordinated disclosure strategy. So for instance, we collect a great deal of data on the S&E workforce, and our surveys will sometimes query the same population, highly educated S&E researchers, multiple times. So we talk to a very specific population, and in addition to the population being specific, doctorate earners tend to have highly public profiles, and they willingly share information about themselves through not only their own websites, but tons of different freely available sources. So in part because of this, NCSES believed it was necessary to form a governance group to consider larger disclosure issues in the center, and how changes in disclosure on one survey might impact another survey that collects similar constructs from a similar population. We intended the governance group to not only provide direction for confidentiality issues within NCSES, but also act as a sharing group so the other surveys could benefit from any disclosure-related research that we were doing, or anyone in the center was doing, or whatever practices related to disclosure were being implemented in the different surveys. So next slide. So sorry, the writing is so small first, but as a result of this reflection, NCSES decided to revamp our disclosure governance by developing and implementing a confidentiality policy for NCSES. There were two specific outcomes from this policy that are apropos to our discussion today. The first is being a set of standards and guidelines addressing disclosure-related topics, and the second outcome was the establishment of the Disclosure Review Board in NCSES. So I'll talk about the DRB first. The goal of the DRB was not only to get into, the goal of the DRB was not to get into the minutia for all disclosure-related issues with NCSES, but rather to provide direction and advice to the center regarding disclosure practices. So, for example, the DRB might not be responsible for the day-to-day review of different tables and products to make sure statistical disclosure techniques were properly implemented, but rather the DRB was set up to think through thorny SDL, statistical disclosure limitation issues that required solutions that were not readily apparent to the reviewer, which is often me. Other issues that NCSES envisioned the DRB addressing included overseeing our restricted use data licensing process, specifically in the evaluation of whether a research product required restricted use data, reviewing disclosure-related research that had been conducted by NCSES, and providing input related to disclosure when NCSES developed new dissemination tools. In terms of administrative details, we'd ultimately decided that the chief statistician, who also serves as the NCSES confidentiality officer, would be the ranking member of the DRB. Myself, as a slightly less ranking member of the DRB, I was in charge of setting the agenda for the meetings, coordinating any guest attendings, and doing general prep for the meetings, ensuring that the full DRB has the necessary documentation for the meeting and any other housekeeping items associated with the DRB. So in terms of membership, in addition to myself and the chief statisticians, and chief statistician, the DRB is also composed of two other mass stats that are dedicated to the various survey programs within our center, our boss, and there's also a member from the team that's dedicated to dissemination of the data to the public. And when we address a disclosure topic specifically related to a survey, we'll invite other necessary stakeholders to the meeting. We meet about once every 3 weeks, which sometimes feels a bit too frequent, but if there's nothing to discuss, we just canceled the meeting. The second outcome from adopting the confidentiality policy was a set of standards and guidelines that NCSES DRB uses to guide its work. These were developed with contract support from Westat, and the standards and guidelines codify how NCSES approaches disclosure within the center. The standards address how NCS protects both microdata and tabular data, as well as they address other repeatable procedures within the center, such as how to execute a restricted data license, or the steps that are required to pre-release embargoed data to approved researchers, are a couple examples of what else the standards and guidelines address. The DRB, or at least myself, leans heavily on these standards when making disclosure-related decisions. In fact, the standards facilitate quick decision-making for most disclosure-related procedures, and thus they limit internal debate as to how to handle specific topics, and generally they improve the efficiency as to how the DRB works. Next slide. So this just talks a little bit about what I see the benefits of the DRB. Often the last thing that staff members want to do is attend another standing meeting, but the DRB provides an avenue to facilitate accomplishing disclosure-related tasks that were previously difficult to do. So for instance, having a DRB meeting at a regularly scheduled time improves the efficiency of our disclosure-related decision-making. I think that by establishing a formal time to meet, the DRB has a scheduled setting for key stakeholders to get into a room and see how a disclosure-related initiative may impact other programs or processes within NCSES. For instance, if I want to implement a new swapping algorithm in one of our surveys, well, I need to get a lot of people to agree with that. So a change such as that involves myself and then the chief statistician and my boss who must approve any kind of change or new policy initiative that I cook up. Then the survey manager needs to be involved because they need to implement it at the contractor site. And then finally, our data dissemination team needs to be involved as well to understand what these changes are, and even more importantly, be prepared to implement them when they're ready. So with the DRB, many of the communication-related tasks are taken care of at once, and everyone understands the issues related to making a change. The DRB meeting time fosters everyone getting together and thinking through what potential issues of making a change or a new disclosure initiative can have. Having the meeting also brings a variety of perspectives to solve DRB-related problems. In licensing processing requires our applicants to first submit a research plan to NCSES outlining what it is and how they wanted to do it. So prior to DRB, most licensing decisions were made mostly by me. I get input from other people, but with a group reviewing these plans, I get a wider variety of input to help make a decision on the application, and more importantly, help put the applicant on a path to getting the data that they need. The other DRB members have analytical suggestions, other sources of data, and even potentially contractor support to help meet a potential licensee needs that I probably might not have been aware of had I not been getting a group together. So the last point is that NCSES is just a small organization, so the staff have a wide variety of responsibilities. Nobody really addresses one particular topic. And so while disclosure is a key area of concern of NCSES, it's just one of several responsibilities that staff attends to. The DRB provides a forum for us to sit down and focus on disclosure as a group rather than individually ourselves. It also fosters critical thinking about disclosure within NCSES. It's helped our stakeholders move from just implementing a set of rules to thinking about more strategically and systematically about how we can be moving the center forward in our disclosure practices. It's a forum to share research as well. And it's just an opportunity for the stakeholders to get together and provide the best analytical products while still maintaining a high level of protection for our respondents. I think having all those different perspectives in the room and talking about it as a group serves all stakeholders and respondents better than just one person making these decisions by themselves. So that is a brief overview of the DRB at NCSES. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Darius. And our final presenter today is Greg Fratelny. Greg became the Chief Data Officer at the U.S. Department of Education in July of 2019. Greg started his public sector career as a statistician using data to improve student outcomes and business operations in the Department of Education's Office of Federal Student Aid, the agency that serves over 40 million customers with a loan portfolio of over $1.4 trillion. There, he helped establish FSA's Enterprise Data Office and became FSA's Director of Statistical Research and Modeling. In 2018, Greg became the Director of the Program and Policy Studies Service, which was ED's internal think tank responsible for conducting policy analysis and for developing consumer information tools such as the College Scorecard. As CDO, Greg leads ED's new Office of the Chief Data Officer, which is responsible for data governance, open data initiatives, and data analytics to improve the agency's ability to leverage data as a strategic asset. So take it away, Greg.
Hi, folks. Actually, next slide, please. As Michael mentioned, I'm the Chief Data Officer for the U.S. Department of Education. Through that history, I don't really lead our department's disclosure review board, but I do have a unique history within our department that I think we kind of thought provided some unique insights into operations and coordination. So while I talk a little bit about our disclosure review board structure, I'm really here to kind of talk about how our agency is really handling DRBs within the context of governance and data governance overall. So these are just some of the themes that I'm going to be covering today. How have we at the Department of Education really operationalized disclosure review? how we responded to recent developments like the Evidence Act, and the importance of coordination to minimizing disclosure risk, especially since data will only become more cross-cutting in the future. So slide 3, please. So, a lot of this may not be terribly surprising to folks, but generally speaking, agency heads, delegate certain authorities to program office heads. In our department, that generally means the secretary delegates to assistant secretaries. From a privacy perspective, the most recognizable authority is the department's senior agency official for privacy, the SAOP. They ultimately have authority across multiple privacy domains, data sharing agreements with other agencies, privacy safeguards, and so on. At our department, that role has always had a very strong relationship and really a rich history with the department's chief information officer, chief data officer more recently, but also the chief privacy officer. A lot of times it's the same person in some instances. 3 groups are, at the Department of Education are generally recognized with respect to disclosure review. There's a variety of types of data, variety of uses, statistical enforcement, consumer information. So that's really kind of reflected in how we've structured a disclosure review process. There's a broad Department of Education disclosure review board, and they're responsible for approving disclosure avoidance techniques for all data releases by program offices. That excludes federal student aid and the Institute of Education Sciences. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. Those are the other 2 boards. But with this particular board, it's chaired by a senior statistician from our privacy policy office. And there's broad representation on the board from across the Department of Education. Every single program office, I believe, is represented there. The Institute for Education Sciences, established through ESRA, and that's the Education Sciences Reform Act, especially the Department Statistical Agency, NCES, has its own disclosure review board. That board is also chaired by a senior statistician. They have experience and knowledge in the area of confidentiality and disclosure limitation practices. It has 4 members from the Department's Statistical Agency, the National Center for Education Statistics. It also has 4 members from the broader Institute of Education Sciences, 1 from each remaining center, and the Office of the Deputy Director for Science. Federal student aid, as the department's and really the federal government's first performance-based organization, has what's called a DRT, a data response team, and they really manage both the data request fulfillment and the disclosure avoidance processes at federal student aid. So unlike your more traditional program offices or statistical offices, FSA handles a really high volume of requests, but any one particular request it's a little bit smaller in scope. When I led FSA's data response team, it was probably around 2017 or 2018, we typically handled about 500 data requests per year. So kind of given the complexity of FSA data, that team is really made up of data experts from Prop FSA. I think at that point in time, it was about 26 different individuals that participated, and they meet twice a week, given the volume of requests that they get. So those are really the 3 groups currently recognized by the department with respect to disclosure review. If we can move on to slide 4, please. A lot has really happened in the past year or 2, and I think a lot of agencies, not just mine, are dealing with the same issues. The Evidence Act is the most obvious example. It contains a variety of statutory mandates around data access and release and protection. I think despite a lot of those perceived challenges, the theme I keep coming back to when I talk to folks about the Act is that there really are tremendous gains to be made once you decide to coordinate. I mean, like really coordinate effectively. And so that's not necessarily specific to just privacy, but really to managing data overall. A lot of that coordination was mandated through the development of certain positions, the CDO, the evaluation officer, statistical official, participation in various advisory committees that kind of require coordination, and mandating particular points of coordination. When you think about like the chief information officer, the performance improvement officer, they're all referenced in statute as particular areas where the CDO, among others, need to coordinate. The Department of Education, when the Evidence Act was passed, we took a very intentional approach to solving those Evidence Act challenges. It really helped that our political leadership saw that there was value to better coordination, and we could really have some major impacts to informing decision making. I think unlike most agencies, the Department of Education actually did an agency reorganization to help with some of those efficiencies. With respect to disclosure review, the reorg placed the responsibilities associated with several roles, and I'm thinking particularly of like the chief privacy officer and that senior agency official for privacy, on the director of the Student Privacy Policy Office. This, I think, more or less recognized the complex interplay between privacy within the context of various laws and statutes. So not just the Privacy Act, but also FERPA and PPRA and the Higher Education Act, and the list goes on. There's a lot of different things that kind of go on when it goes to releasing data, and I think this reorg kind of helped recognize that complexity. So that Student Privacy Policy Office is also more or less the program management office for the departments, that broader disclosure review board. It was also intentional that the department did not place this function for disclosure review within the newly created Office of the Chief Data Officer, the office that I lead. Since the CDO has a mandate in the Evidence Act to make data open by default, we more or less wanted to avoid any sort of appearance of conflicts, having one person responsible, not just for managing risk of disclosure, but also getting as much data out the door as possible. So that's it was an intentional thing on our part to create it in two slightly different offices. But those offices, that Chief Data Officer's office and the Student Privacy Policy Office, they're actually sister offices within our Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. It's a coordinating office within the Department of Education with broad authorities over policies. So you really have two offices responsible for data office and privacy policy right next to each other. And that's not just organizationally, but also physically. A lot of our staff are intermingled in the same place on the same floor of the building. So there's a lot of opportunities for coordination and collaboration there. That reorganization last year also envisioned more coordination through the department's first data governance board that was created just last year. I chair that board, and it has the senior agency official for privacy as an at-large member, along with some of those other positions like the statistical official, the evaluation officer, and the performance improvement officer. More recently, the department has selected a new senior leader to lead the Student Privacy Policy Office and serve as that senior agency official for privacy. That SAOP designation literally just happened today. I mean, my notes that I have here actually has them listed as the presumptive SAOP, but that is actually official now. So a lot of new things are happening, and they're happening every day to kind of move us toward in the right direction. That office, the Student Privacy Policy Office, is currently working with my own office, among others, in reviewing disclosure review board charters, as well as the disclosure avoidance processes and controls that kind of come along with it. So next slide, please, slide 5. So, not necessarily within the Department of Education, but I've observed some challenges that come along with data specifically collected for programmatic purposes, and I was going to talk a little bit about that right now. So as an example, data can be used for reporting, but also for pure operations. When a student submits an application for federal student aid, this is the FAFSA, that's what a lot of folks recognize as the name is of that document in data collection. A transaction is immediately being created to determine eligibility for student aid, but it's also being used for developing new thresholds for financial need. It's used for improving operations. Reports are created for Congress, the public, and the list goes on. So there's a lot of uses for this data than what's purely operational. The very first thing that it gets used for. Programmatic data. There's a lot of other additional restrictions spelled out in statute. Who can use that data and for what purpose. Just as an example, data within the National Student Loan Data System. So this is a system that manages data for student loan payments. A lot of those transactions, and manages delinquencies and defaults. The Higher Education Act actually prohibits non-governmental researchers from accessing PII in that system. It also prohibits the use of that data for marketing purposes. FAFSA data has use restrictions. Can only be used for the application, award, and administration of student aid, state aid, institutional aid, Title IV aid, and a aid awarded by entities designated by the secretary. I want to make sure I got that phrase in there exactly correct. So when sharing data, even though if you solve the pure disclosure privacy issues, you still need to be mindful of a lot of these use restrictions when you have a particular product. Some actors also have access to this data outside of our walls, and think of states and districts and schools and institutes of higher education. Some of the techniques used in traditional disclosure avoidance efforts can appear to have kind of an impact on the stated purpose of a release of data. If you're thinking about data being reported for accountability purposes, think of the impact that perturbation is going to have on that. Consider how to reconcile publicly released perturbed data with actual raw data that may have been used for enforcement purposes. So these are a lot of the challenges that I think come with program data that we kind of deal with. And I think the example that I wanted to talk about a little bit was the college scorecard, because it really touches on a few of those issues. For those unfamiliar, the scorecard is one of the better known websites at the Department of Education. It's primarily a consumer information tool. It provides information to students and parents when they make decisions about colleges. And, it's got graduation rates, transfer rates, default rates, earnings information for students, and they're all rolled up to either the institution level or sometimes even the field of study at that institution. So that data is available not just in that website, but also there's a privacy protected data that's available for download and use by researchers. So putting that product together and ready for the public release was really kind of a pretty major effort for a lot of the issues that I kind of just mentioned. It's sourced from information from a variety of places. Some of the data comes from our statistical agency, the National Center for Education Statistics. A lot of our aggregate calculations about completion and other student aid information, they're based on PIA that comes out of federal student aid. And earnings information, that's actually coming from the IRS. It's produced by mapping our student level data to their tax return information. So what this kind of effectively means is data for this one product ultimately had to go through 3 very different disclosure review processes that needed to be addressed. That included the one for the Institute for Education Sciences, that run the enrollment data, our IRS data, the earning data had to go through their review board, and then federal student aid. And so while FSA has its own process, given the necessary kind of coordination and other challenges, the scorecard is actually one of the very few FSA products where the disclosure review is delegated to that broader Department of Education DRB. So that coordination, was really helped by the structure of our board. As an example, NCES's chief statistician serves as a ex officio member on the EdDRB. We also have staff from IES and FSA who have historically participated on that board. So these things really help out when we actually have these major products with cross-cutting data involved. Also related to this, given that this was a consumer information tool where decisions were being made at the institution level, there was a natural and I think reasonable reluctance to use disclosure avoidance methods that introduce noise into the data. It might be reasonable for a researcher where they are modeling things on average, but perhaps not so much for like a student that may be expecting a very particular outcome when they look at some information on a web page. So years ago, when the scorecard was being launched, there was actually a very conscious decision to largely rely on a robust suppression and complementary suppression technique. The trade-off there, of course, is that there was a lot of data that ended up missing. But I think that was a judgment call the agency made and determined was reasonable when we actually released this data. So, with that kind of example in mind, I think privacy has been, it continues to really be a top priority for the Department of Education. I think that's reflected in some of our more mature processes that we've developed. When I think about future challenges for disclosure review boards across government, I'm thinking more and more about some of these new mandates from the Evidence Act. Outside the context of the College Scorecard or even the Department of Education, I generally observe, reluctance from system owners or data owners to share data because of that inherent risk. They're serving as, responsible stewards for the data that they're managing and collecting, and I kind of understand that concern. But through, certain Evidence Act provisions like the presumption of access, my understanding is no agency is going to be able to withhold that data from a statistical agency unless there's a legal reason it cannot do that. General concerns over disclosure risk is not really a viable reason to withhold data anymore. So I think this kind of represents a challenge to privacy budgets in general, as others beyond the collecting agency may be releasing data as well. I think this is obviously a challenge that's partially resolved with coordination across federal agencies as they more or less operationalize what that presumption of access is going to really look like. And so kind of with some of those new government-wide initiatives, I'm really looking forward to all that, the value that we can create for evidence building while also protecting privacy. And that's all I had lined up to chat about.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. That was a nice little trip down memory lane for me. So we got a question in the chat, and I'm going to expand that question slightly and open it up to all of our presenters today. And it's a question about burden. So, like, what would you say is the volume of disclosure review requests that your respective agencies have to process in a year, and for the members of your respective DRBs, like what percentage of their time does reviewing and assessing and approving those requests take? Is this a full-time job for folks, or is it just other duties as assigned? So I'll open it up to the floor for folks to respond to that.
This is Darius. I'll take a crack at it. Well, there's the administrative time, which I consider to be like, the hour meeting. So say about 20 hours worth of meetings per se. And then you might have a little homework involved from one meeting to the next if there's a follow-up question involved or if more research needs to be done. So, I think I pick up the bulk of the work because I'm the primary disclosure analyst within the center. But I would say for those that don't have my responsibilities, maybe, in addition to the meetings, probably, a couple hours every 2 weeks in addition. I don't think it's a super high burden participating in the DRB itself. There might be a couple extra tasks that people have that they need to work on outside of the DRB, but those are usually rolled up with what people need to do for their jobs anyway. So I don't think the commitment is too daunting for people that choose to sit on the board itself.
Gary, what would you say for burden on the census DRB?
Just trying to make, am I unmuted? Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can, Gary.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I don't know, we get roughly 1,000 to 1,500 requests per year, I'd say. So we get quite a few. We have up to 2 meetings per week of 2 hours, of up to 2 hours apiece. And there's a decent amount of prep time that goes into each meeting. Especially as a technical co-chair, I want to spend at least a couple hours reviewing the items. So it's a significant ask, but we are not. It's not our full-time jobs, and we do have people from all across the Census Bureau lending different levels of sort of expertise into this process. So some people are a little bit more technical and understand the math side of it better. Other people may have very little technical expertise, but quite a bit of data knowledge and use case knowledge. We have some people with policy experience and communications experience. So there's a broad representation, and so it's quite a bit of time, but it's not a full-time job for any individual. And I'd say what really helps, I think, in our latest change, Rob talked about how we have the 2 technical co-chairs and the program manager. He was the chair prior to that change, and he sort of handled all of that, right? So he would run the meetings and be a voting member. And I think we realized that's a little bit too much to ask. So chopping up the duties amongst more people, I think, really helps. We now have 2 technical co-chairs to kind of carry the burden of leading the discussion. The program manager actually leads the meetings and keeps track of everything and keeps the boat afloat, as Rob said. So breaking things up really, really helps.
Can I add to that? Can you hear me?
Yes, Rob, we can.
Yep.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So, for any given person of the 12 people who are sitting on the DRB, we figured it was between 20 and 40% time. One of the good things about this is that this has been institutionalized, and because of that, the other directorates within the Census Bureau are actually aware that, look, you have to have the resources that you are dedicating to this. Two people between 20 and 40% of their time on any given week will be devoted to disclosure avoidance. But Gary said we had between about 1,000 different submissions in any given year. So, on any given DRB meeting, people are reviewing, between 500 and 700 pages worth of data. It helps very much to have tools, Python tools that will allow you to, run some programming things. But ultimately, each individual board member is responsible for signing off on that. But it really has been institutionalized. And, is it a burden? Yeah, but do we have to do it by law? Absolutely. And it's worth it's worth the time that we put into it. Thanks.
And to add a little bit more, the disclosure avoidance officers that I talked about are a really key part of this as well. We used to have very few of them, and we did not have the training. So some of them really maybe shouldn't have been in their roles potentially. And now with the training and the certification, we have quite a few of them, and the burden is really spread out quite a lot between amongst them, and more of our products are being released by delegated authority now that we have folks trained and certified and with this delegated authority. So that's a huge part of this as well.
Greg or Daniel, do you want to chime in on this question, or?
This is Greg. I can chime in. I think as I mentioned before, I mean, I was much more involved in the DRT's process, and so like to really kind of calculate the volume and the burden of components to this, my information is going to be a little bit dated and not necessarily reflective of like the broader Department of Education. But the Federal Student Aid's Data Response Team, we met twice a week. That was 1 hour. I mean, staff were involved in working on these requests outside of those timeframes. But the first step in the process was always to see if there was a similar request that we fulfilled in recent history, and there's no need to really kind of create new burden, not to mention like increase risk of disclosure by generating a new product. So that was always the first thing we do because we tracked our data requests. But the request typically came in through FOIA. In addition to other routes. I mean, it's a combination of the two. So I think our fulfillment timeline was generally 21 days. And if I remember correctly, that was the FOIA standard. So that included requirements gathering, fulfilling the requests, and conducting that disclosure review is what happened in those 21 days. And I think we managed, it was about 500 data requests a year. And there's about 20 or so staff involved. And their primary responsibilities were working within the operational business units. They just happened to also, they were experts in these data systems. So that's what their role was.
So picking up on something that Gary mentioned about skill sets and training. So disclosure avoidance is a very technical, specialized set of skills, set of statistical skills. What have been your respective experiences in terms of recruiting individuals with those skills or training individuals to be able to perform those functions?
So this is Gary. I think that the number one skill is to actually have some hands-on experience with the data. I think when you have that, especially on the disclosure avoidance reviewers, even if they don't completely understand all the math necessary in a particular methodology, the intuition is there. I think so that matters. It does matter to have a broad range of skills, though, too. I mean, to have the policy person who might not weigh in on any of the technical discussion, but can kind of keep us grounded in the policy issues is important. To have some of the folks experienced working with the end users and what the use cases are is important. So I think having a broad range of skills is important, and then of course having some people with the technical ability is also very important.
Yeah, this is Darius. I agree with that. I would just add to what Gary said. It's been helpful to the NSF General Counsel Office is really helpful to me too in understanding the laws that are associated with confidentiality, privacy, and disclosure in the federal statistical system. And I also think it's useful to, when you're teaching people about disclosure, showing them how intruders think, like how they might use an indirect identifier and how they might use other publicly available data sources in concert with an NCSES data source to, uncover either an attribute or the identity of one of our respondents. So providing an overview of how these intruders look, I think, is how these intruders work and what they're trying to do is crucial when you're training someone about disclosure.
Yeah, I really agree with that. In fact, in our training, we have the second half day portion of it. We go through a bunch of sort of practical examples like that.
So changing gears slightly, how would you all describe the tone of, well, of your DRB meetings, and also kind of the attitude of the data offices within your agencies towards your DRB and your DRB process? Is it collegial? Is it adversarial? Is it largely ignored?
This is Daniel at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I just want to jump sort of answering all three of the questions. Ours is not as institutionalized, so speaking about the attitude and everything, I think that it's something that's becoming more. The Bureau is taking it, more seriously. I think it was John Elting, the last chair, that got the members. Their membership on the DRB as part of their performance plan, actually. And so before that, I guess it wasn't at all. And then just recently, I've, been actually talking to their manager, so I know that they're aware that they do it. So there's not, I don't think they have a lot of time that they're given to do this as part of their job, even though they're, tasked with doing it. That's why I would say for us, we found that it's much more important to find people that are interested, have an interest in doing it. And but I would say our meetings are very cordial in our office, and we spend a lot of times if we don't. Our requests all seem to come in at once. That's maybe everybody's experience, I don't know, but they seem to come in more in bunches. They don't come uniformly, across the year. And so sometimes we're very busy doing that, and other times we're not as busy. And so we've been really trying to focus more on educating ourselves and others in the Bureau about newer disclosure limitation methods and the wider range of research.
Do any of the other panelists want to weigh in on tone and attitude?
I think within NCSES, it's all right. I mean, I think the DRB itself as a group is very collegial, and I think we work together. And then sometimes the DRB asks analysts maybe to for extra work to increase their analysis to make their case of whatever there is trying to get their DRB approved. And I mean, I'm sure they don't like to to be asked to do these things, but it's certainly not overly antagonistic. And I think NCSES does a pretty good job of communicating the value of or the not the value, the importance of protection of our respondents, and staff is pretty accepting of these arguments, so they usually work well with us.
Great.
Yeah,
So
this
we
is
are.
Gary.
Oh, go ahead.
Gary, go for it.
Go ahead, Rob. Oh, okay.
Okay. Please.
Go ahead, Rob.
After you, Gary. Thank you. I'm off.
All right. I would say it's evolved a little bit over time with the Census Bureau. I would say it's never been adversarial, but we did, several years ago, really beef up our focus, so to speak, and make sure a lot more people all around the Census Bureau are aware that they needed to bring things to the Disclosure Review Board that maybe hadn't in the past. And our standards got a little bit stricter. So I think there was a little bit of a shock to the system at first. But I'd say it has evolved to the point where it's very collegial. We, like I said in our presentation, we try to see ourselves as sort of shepherding products through the system as much as possible. It has really helped that we've been able to grow our research staff, our disclosure avoidance research staff a little bit, so that sometimes when more difficult problems prop up at the DRB, we have now a few examples where our research staff has been able to get together with program area staff and help them develop a methodology into production that, is better for privacy while still respecting the accuracy for the use cases that they care about. So again, growing the staff and splitting up more roles helps, and so that's what I would say.
I'm going to add. This is Rob. I'm going to add to that if you don't mind. But to be very quick, Michael. One of the things that we did learn that if you're not approachable, then what you do is you lose the opportunity to change, to impact the culture, right? What collectively, we are all responsible. We're all responsible for the safe release of data. Right? And if you're adversarial, if you lose the opportunity to say, to have the conversation saying, no, this is why this is important. This is what it means for you. This is what it means for the people who trusted you with their data. And so by being approachable and by, working with the data submitters offline outside of the DRB to make sure that their data product meets the standards, it works. It really does work. And so this is what we found out, and we tried to institutionalize that.
And that's a great segue into my final question. So we're at time, but I have one last question that I want to pose to each of the panelists, and I'll suggest we go in presentation order. So we'll start with Daniel. With the passage of the Evidence Act, there are going to be a lot of agencies that have not had institutionalized processes for performing disclosure avoidance risk assessment that will now have to start doing so. From your own experiences setting up DRBs and disclosure avoidance apparati for your agencies, what would your number one lesson learned or piece of advice be for agencies that need to create a DRB-like structure or better institutionalize their disclosure avoidance procedures? So Daniel, you can take first step.
Well, I think getting the support from the people involved in producing the data products, getting their, as you say, not to make it adversarial and to change the culture, as you said, is I think very important because, as you said, we're all in this together to release the data as much as we can. We all want to do that, but we have to do it in a way that is protecting the sensitive data. And so as long as you get them on your team and make them aware of that you exist, that's a big first step. I'd leave it at that.
Rob, what would your piece of advice be?
To codify the rules. Disclosure avoidance should not be something that's passed down from one generation to another, but the rules need to be codified in a central place. And to be able to codify these rules, it doesn't have to. You don't have to move mountains. Rather, you can build on the work that all of the different boards that you brought together today have spoken about, Michael. And we would be more than happy to share our information.
Thanks. Gary?
Sorry, mute button. So I would say, and not sound like a broken record, but to really get buy-in from the whole area, if you're going to do this, really commit to it and put a lot of resources into it, get a lot of people involved in it, spread out the workload so it's not just a few people handling everything and getting frustrated. And also, I think when a representative group of people from across your agency are all involved, there's more buy-in. When a particular program has people involved in the disclosure avoidance review part of it, there's just a little bit more buy-in from that program to actually respect the decisions and try to do proper statistical disclosure limitations. So if you're going to do it, commit to it and put a lot of resources into it. Take it seriously. Spread out the load. That would be my advice.
Great. Darius?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with everything that's been said so far, especially stressing, the codification of the rules. I think the standards and guidelines that Westat helped us put together were really helpful for communicating what it was the DRB wanted to do. And then in addition to that, providing staff with support or documentation to help implement whatever rules are put forth in the standards and guidelines. I mean, I think everyone and within NCSES and probably at most federal agencies, disclosure is one piece of what their job is. So if we can help them implement and execute what it is that the DRB is looking to do, that can really go a long way in fostering, both goodwill and actual execution of what your intents are.
All right, and last but certainly not least, Greg.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I would mention, I don't know that it's necessarily that insightful, and it's kind of been referenced a couple of times across the other panelists, is, I mean, it really is bringing in the right expertise. As a lot of the folks know, like the panelists and people on the call, privacy is complicated, especially when you consider like the number of publications that you do over time and the things you need to keep in mind. So you're going to pay for it one way or another. You probably want to pay for it up front with dollars, and later on with confidence or reputation, impacts to confidence or your reputation at your agency. So I do think that like just making sure you have folks that actually understand the details of disclosure avoidance techniques, that's probably the best start right there.
And I'd like to also kind of draw people's attention to a comment from Mike Castro in the chat window that I think is also an important one there, and that's to think about and accept disclosure risk as an enterprise risk and approach it from that risk management framework. So with that, I would like to sincerely thank all of our panelists. I think this has been a great discussion today. I'd like to thank everyone who was able to join us. We have another webinar coming up, I believe, in 2 weeks. Is that right, Paul?
It's on September 3rd, so in 3 weeks.
September 3rd, 3 weeks.
Yep.
So that'll be the next in our series. And for those of you who stayed on, thank you for bearing with us through the technical difficulties we had earlier and for going a little over. I wish you all a great rest of your afternoon, and I hope you all stay safe and healthy. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you guys for hosting.
Thank you,
Yeah,
everyone.
thank you.